welcome to our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's fantastic. They've all had us in one room together. Everybody, like-minded people. Can you do me a favor? Can we give the organizing committee a warm round of applause, please? I think it's fantastic that they're here, that all of you are here together. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining us here at the Singapore International Cyber Week 2022. We're grateful you chose to spend your afternoon with us. And this afternoon is going to be really exciting, an esteemed panel, lots of distinguished guests amongst us today. Today, we've got a Q&A session as part of our entire afternoon, and we encourage you to take this opportunity to be chatting with our speakers live. So we're going to be flashing up that QR code. Feel free to scan that right now and interact with our speakers live during the panel discussion later on today. As we're broadcasting live, and this is a live studio, we do encourage you to remain seated throughout our entire time together. For my early birds here in the room, I'd love to start everybody off with a little bit of a Slido multiple choice question. So we're just gonna give you some time to scan that Slido up on the screens, after which I've got two really simple questions to ask you. Okay, all of you all scanned in, all ready to go? Okay, I think we need to give everybody a couple more minutes to get scanned into Slido so you can add in your votes. But I feel like this is a good one to start the conversation. I know our panel is very excited. I think giving our friends in the audience a couple more minutes to do so. Okay, the first question. Are vendors a critical part of your service delivery? Yes, no, not sure. Once you signed in, feel free to cast your votes. I think you're just waiting for a couple more friends to join us. Keeping this active poll on as well. To our virtual audience, feel free to scan that QR code on your screens too to participate in the poll that we have. If you've got any queries about Slido or logging in, do let us know, and we'd be more than happy. Perhaps you can raise your hand. We'd be more than happy to come to you to help you out with the Slido logins. Okay. Everybody all good? Yes? Just getting an indication of what's happening? Okay. Everyone's on their mobile phones, which typically is something that I would kind of be very sus about, but I encourage it right now. Okay. Fantastic. So, are vendors a critical part of your service delivery? Yes, no, not sure. I think we're just waiting for our team here to collate the results to make sure we have them live. Okay, of course. It is, of course, something that we expected. 83% of you. So the panel should be very intriguing for you later on. All right, let's head on to maybe the not sure. We'll get to the not sure part, I think, in the panel as well. Okay, let's get to the second question on Slido. All right, do you have an enterprise-wide strategy for managing end-to-end supply chain risks? Anything from development, acquisition, lifecycle support, and disposal of systems. Oh, we're getting these live votes coming through right now. We've got our panel discussing it very enthusiastically in the front here. Wow. Yeah, this I guess is the sort of result is what I thought actually. So majority of you saying yes. Oh, okay, but of course this is a live poll, so I'm gonna leave this here for about a few more seconds. All right, what is the end result you think? Do you have an enterprise-wide strategy? I guess it does move, but the majority says yes. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully everybody's excited for the afternoon that we have before us. Thank you so much again for being here at the Singapore International Cyber Week 2022 Cyber Supply Chain Conversation. A warm welcome to all our esteemed guests here in the room, and of course, to our audience that's joining us virtually from all around the world. I'm Charmaine E, and I'm very thrilled to be your host all of this afternoon. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated Singapore's digitalisation and increased the complexity of interconnectivity between users, service providers, and their vendors. While digitalisation has catalyzed the adoption of technology, it's also resulted in the growing reliance on vendors to support the delivery of essential services and organizations' day-to-day operations. It is complex, it's a complex problem, and it's not merely about interconnectivities, it's also about interdependencies. So at the SICW Cyber Supply Chain conversation, what we hope to do is to bring together stakeholders, an ecosystem approach, an approach to see what governments, business owners, and vendors can do to discuss how we can have adequate visibility for our security posture by collaborating. To begin our conference proceedings, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Director of Critical Information Infrastructure, Cyber Security Agency of Singapore, Mr. Lim Thian Chin, for some opening remarks. Mr. Lim, please.
Bruce Schneider has once affectionately commented that cyber supply chain is a wicked problem. He says that the supply chain issue is akin to looking for a needle in a haystack, and sometimes we don't even know how the needle or what the needle looks like. It is indeed an uphill battle, but we are not going to run away from it. Today, we congregate here to have a conversation, to start one, to address these issues collectively. A very good afternoon to our esteemed panelists who have traveled a long way to be here with us today, and to our distinguished guests. Thank you for joining us, both physically and virtually. A very warm welcome to Singapore International Cyber Week Cyber Supply Chain Conversation. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated Singapore's digitalization and increased the complexity of interconnectivity between users, service providers, and their vendors. While our cyber supply chain have increased in complexity, so does our reliance on the vendors, and we do not have adequate visibility of their security posture. While cyber supply chain attacks are nothing new, SolarWinds, Kaseya, Colonial Pipeline are among the many supply chain attacks that all of us are familiar with. Many of us still remember the impact of the SolarWinds attack from 2019. And the sleepless nights we all had struggling to comprehend and to deal with the aftermath of the attack. There is an increasing urgency to focus on cyber supply chain security because threat actors have turned these attacks and target the softer underbellies of the companies instead of targeting companies or the victims directly. The cyber supply chain issue is multifaceted and multi-layered, and there are seldom any perfect or easy answers to this wicked problem. Addressing cyber supply chain risks must be multi-pronged effort. The cyber supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link. CSA has published the CII Supply Chain Program paper jointly with our partners from Boston Consultancy Group in July. It addresses 3 core objectives towards the strengthening of cyber resilience in response to the supply chain risk and outline 5 foundational initiatives as a roadmap to address the cyber supply chain challenges. CSA will be sharing more about the program in a video shortly, followed by a panel discussion. With that, welcome again to SICW. I wish you have a fruitful discussion and a thoughtful insights in time to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lin. We will now be moving on to our keynote address by Ms. Erica Lewis, Director, Cybersecurity, Digital Identity at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport in the United Kingdom. Ms. Lewis will be sharing more about the topic on cyber supply chain risks. Ms. Lewis, please.
Well, thank you very much and welcome. I've already been introduced, but I'm really pleased to be here today. I've actually been a part of the Singapore Cyber Week for the last 2 years, but online. So it's really nice to actually come to Singapore, my first time. I arrived last night, very beautiful place, very, very nice to be here. DCMS, the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, plays a key role in the growing of the digital economy. We work on many things, including tech competition, online harms, data policy, and so it makes a lot of sense that cybersecurity sits alongside all of that other thinking and really thinks about the underpinning of the growing digital economy in the UK. Last year, at Christmas time, we published a new UK cyber strategy. Quite different kind of cyber strategy, very much like the cyber strategies that I'm sure you're going to be hearing about across the week, where we are thinking about the whole of society response and the whole of society issues around cybersecurity. With the strategy, we signalled quite a significant 2.6 billion investment in cybersecurity in the UK. It has 5 pillars. The strategy, and DCMS has a significant role in 3 of those, developing what we call the ecosystem, so that's thinking about skills and innovation and growth. Technology, so thinking about how to make technology as it emerges more secure, and thinking about how to catalyse its growth safely in the economy, and then improving resilience across the whole economy. So today, I know we're going to be talking about supply chains. And as the other speakers have already said, for us too in the UK, there's been a huge move online as we've gone through the COVID pandemic. And it's been amazing. We've been able to, well, come to Singapore conferences without leaving literally my bedroom. But we've been able to live and work online in a really effective way. But it has obviously meant that, particularly in the UK, we know companies haven't, in that fast move, paid attention in a way that we would want them to cybersecurity. And also, as we've kind of gone through the last 18 months, I think the threats we would all know have heightened. It would be remiss of me not to mention the Russia-Ukraine war, which I think has heightened the threat. And this comes on top of widespread issues around cybercrime. So I'll give you some compelling numbers. We think that the estimated global annual cost of cybercrime reached about 5.5 trillion euros in 2021. Ransomware attacks alone, we think, cost around 20 billion in 2021. So this isn't an insignificant problem. It's a really significant problem. So in the UK government, what we're trying to do is reduce the cyber risks at source and at scale, manage those residual cyber risks, and develop the skills and the industrial base to make sure that we're much more cyber resilient. So I was really pleased to come on to a panel about cyber supply chains because last month I was in Billington and I was on a panel and I was asked a great question because you don't often get to be asked a question about the other side. They said to me, if you were a cyber criminal, what would you do? How would you come up with one of the best attacks you could come up with? And I said, well, I'd definitely start with the supply chain. In truth, we just don't know enough about our supply chains, and they are really complicated. What we do know is that in the UK, only 13%, so it was much better on the poll, actually, but only 13% of businesses assess risks posed by their suppliers. And as we know, and as we mentioned before, many recent high-profile attacks have actually come through supply chain routes. So if it were me and I was a cyber criminal, I'd be in that supply chain and as far upstream probably as possible. And so, I can mention the Microsoft incident that we've had recently, the Log4j, SolarWinds, and it can give you a bit of an understanding of the different routes into that supply chain, which is really complicated on many different levels. But what we do know is that when you attack at that level, you can get a very successful coverage in terms of your cyber activity. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an outline of what we're doing in the UK to try and help as the government. So we've got 4 key areas. First, we're looking at digital service providers. So it's becoming more and more important for us to think about cloud and managed services. These providers obviously play a really critical role in our digital supply chains. And obviously, if you do breach this kind of supplier, then you have got a very successful attack on your hands. So earlier this year in the UK, we consulted on proposals to strengthen our cyber resilience regulations. And this will include proactively regulating critical service providers, digital service providers, large and small, in a number of key sectors. Secondly, we're starting to look at what we're calling managed service providers, MSPs, and those are the firms that provide that kind of outsourced IT activity. So digital service providers, and then a little bit more broadly, we think there are about 500. I suspect that's an underestimate, if I'm honest. We think there are about 500 of these in the UK. And obviously, again, if you manage to attack one of these managed service providers, you get a very successful cyber attack. They're not covered well enough, we think, in our legislation. So next summer, we're hoping to improve our legislations and network and information systems legislation, NIS legislation, and we are looking to extend that to cover managed service providers. And we're hoping that will be really helpful. Thirdly, we're looking at software. So this for us is beginning to understand the critical issues around software in supply chains, really embryonic work in the UK. There are a few things that we want to do to address the risks. We need to very much understand what is going on in terms of software, how software is built. And we also need to be thinking about what the potential policy options are around supporting people to understand and use software in a safer way. And then fourthly, we're looking at procurement. We need to, I think, and this is across the board, in the UK, I'm sure in other places, think about procurement practices, recognizing that there is insufficient knowledge at a company level that balances out the power between very large digital companies and very small companies who want to use their services. So in all of this, we want to be proportionate. What we don't want is that people are not using digital services, and we know the incredible benefits that these bring. So we're thinking about how you balance out cyber risks against the real benefits of using digital services. So one thing I did want to highlight is, I'm sure you will have come across or will come across over the week, the National Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC, who are our partners in the UK, technical partners in the UK. They have just last week published new guidance on supply chains. So it covers everything from using what we call our Cyber Essentials scheme. So that's basic guidance for companies around cybersecurity issues. And we're hoping to get larger companies to also use this guidance. I want to say one last quick thing, because I'm sure my time is running out and we need to get to questions, and that is, I do want to mention skills. In the UK, we're doing a lot in terms of trying to make sure that we have the right skills in place to actualize this kind of work. And without that, then we won't be in a position to actually understand our supply chain or indeed deal with the issues around it. We know in the UK that 51% of UK businesses lack basic technical cyber skills. That is a whole other conversation. I'm sure there will be a panel on it later in the week. Look out for it. hope that summary's been useful to you, and I look forward to joining panel members to hear and answer your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Next, we will be playing a video on the current state of cyber supply chain risks. Sit back and enjoy.
The world as we know it is evolving, and digital transformation is at the heart of this change. While dependencies on digital technologies have increased, so has the threat of cyber attacks. As the volume of these attacks go up, their costs go down, placing our critical information infrastructure at increased risk of disruption. Now, more than ever, there has been an increase in cyber supply chain attacks globally, including some high-profile victims in recent memory. Singapore, like the rest of the world, is not spared from this threat, and 3 key challenges stand in the way of building cyber supply chain resilience. Supply chain networks are global, complex, and multifaceted, resulting in minimal visibility, limiting efforts to assess exposure effectively. Vendor risk management practices today are compliance-focused, point-in-time, and manual, which is not future-ready. Sectoral and organizational silos limit the coordinated action required to manage risks. The need of the hour is change, a change in our approach to managing cyber supply chain risks.
CSA, in partnership with the Boston Consulting Group, is driving this change through a cutting-edge program to comprehensively improve the cyber resilience of critical information infrastructures in Singapore, a program designed to tackle new and emerging threats, with 3 key objectives: to increase the transparency and visibility of such risk, to align a shared understanding that frames a consistent approach to managing these risks, to catalyze an ecosystem of CII owners and vendors, incentivized to continuously improve resilience. To achieve these objectives, 5 initiatives have been identified. Of these, the most critical initiative is to create deep visibility and aggregating the view at the national level for enhanced risk monitoring and response.
We realize that changing our current reality will take time, but this initiative has already begun to deliver impact. The banking sector typically manages complex technology vendor landscapes where it is challenging to gain deep supply chain visibility. Immediate vendors are often known, but not the sub-suppliers, which impedes deep visibility into cyber risks. This results in the inability to quickly identify the blast radius resulting from a possible cyber attack. We recently took a list of a leading bank's 30 Tier 1 suppliers and were able to map out 10,000 Tier 2 suppliers and over 100,000 Tier 3 suppliers in 2 hours. With the help of the automated self-service platform, organizations can have a single pane of glass to view a wide range of risk factors and attributes. Leveraging the comprehensive relationship graph in the platform, organizations can quickly identify the blast radius arising from a cyber attack. Another challenge is that traditionally, supplier risk assessments are point in time and performed during initial onboarding or procurement. This approach is compliance-focused and does not reflect real-time changes to risks posed by technology vendors. For better control, there needs to be a shift to continuous monitoring through a platform that tracks suppliers' cybersecurity risks in real time. The vulnerabilities findings are then passed to the suppliers along with the patch and remediation action required. We found that this continuous proactive monitoring speeds up remediation efforts tremendously. Another challenge organizations have to manage is to identify concentration risks in their supply chains, exposing them to potential for major disruption. But by comprehensively mapping the supply chain, organizations can identify concentrated vendors for their suppliers and sub-suppliers. Organizations can identify Tier 2 suppliers which are highly concentrated and connected to the Tier 1 suppliers. Here's one example of a Tier 2 supplier that we've identified to be used by 70% of Tier 1 suppliers. Organizations can leverage this data to correlate with cyber and financial risk scoring to triangulate highly concentrated risky vendors. As you can see, the program is already shaping the future with cutting-edge capabilities like deep visibility into vendor relationship, real-time risk monitoring, triage, and remediation, identifying highly concentrated vendors, data-driven solutions to achieve improved efficiency and completeness of data. These capabilities will be key to building a future where all organizations in Singapore can effortlessly achieve deep supply chain visibility with automated continuous risk monitoring and mitigation. To achieve this vision and to scale these capabilities nationally, our aim is to collaborate extensively and offer these solutions to CII owners. And CSA is eager to partner with you on this journey of building a safer, stronger, and more cyber-resilient Singapore.
A truly insightful video, right, ladies and gentlemen? I think that really sets the tone for our panel discussion, which is going to happen right now. It's my pleasure to be inviting our moderator up on stage for this session, Mr. Paul O'Rourke, Managing Director and Partner at Boston Consulting Group. Please welcome. Welcome, welcome. Joining him on this panel as well, Mr. King Seng Wei, Group Chief Information Security Officer and Managing Director of DBS Group. Also on this panel, we have Ms. Erica Lewis, Director, Cybersecurity and Digital Identity Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sports. Also joining our panel, we have Mr. James Rosenthal, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Blue Voyant. And last but certainly not the least, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joshua Kennedy White, Advisor to the Board of Interos. A round of applause for our panel, please. Paul, stage is all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As I was reflecting on the last 5 years in cyber, a lot of focus has gone into cyber, a lot of investment's gone into cyber, a lot of organisations and governments have put a lot of focus on cyber. Yet if you look at it impartially, we're not winning. Erica gave some very compelling statistics in terms of losses, and it's not too hard on any one day to see numerous breaches, losses and impacts across geographies and across organisations, regardless of size. And I was reflecting on this, and I think it's quite compelling that despite all of this work over the last 5 years and a lot of investment in cyber, the last 5 years is probably going to be easier than the next 5 years. What we're facing is a very complex problem. And the last 5 years have been characterised by the control in our environment. We can invest in our own organisation, we can improve it, and we still haven't done a great job of that based on the losses and impacts. But now we're facing a much bigger problem. The attackers and the attack vectors have obviously gone to the supply chain, where we don't have management control, where we can't put in technology. And it's not as though we're doing a great job as an industry globally today, and yet we're facing a much bigger, complex problem going forward. And it's in that context and really landscape of what are we facing and how do we go forward that I'm pleased to invite the panel here today. We have Seng Wei representing DBS, Erica representing policy and government, Jim, who's representing Blue Voyant, and Josh representing Interos. And so we give a spectrum of capabilities and opinions here, from end user to policy and government to providers as well. Because this is a collective problem. It's a collective issue that, as I said before, we're not actually winning today. We've got a much more complex problem going forward if we don't come together as an industry and as solutions and capability from policy, from end users to providers, and actually rethink the whole approach. And credit to CSA in terms of what they've done in terms of really stepping back and trying to frame this problem statement, trying to understand what it is, and interested to hear the opinions of the panel today and really what are some of those approaches we can, and probably more importantly, should be doing. So I'll ask Seng Wei first, as an end user, and this is representing bank and end users, is what are some of these compelling issues that are really driving you around supply chain?
Okay. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think the video have made my work easier. So basically, I think some of the common things that I mentioned in the video actually it's also what as end user we face as well, right? I mean, why is it it's a problem that is difficult to tackle because it's very complex, right? I mean, we have a supplier, right? But how do we know about the breadth and the depth of all your suppliers? So it's not an easy understanding to tackle this, right? So first of all, I think if we follow the NIST cybersecurity framework, one of the key things, you can't protect what you do not know. And identification is the first step of everything, right? And if you don't know what you have, of course you can't defend it, right? But if you look at the attack itself, right? I mean, supply chain attack happens, recently has been more, but I think it actually happened since even the RSA days, right? I mean, probably more than 10 years ago, right? But the point is about, while it's complex for us, actually it's complex for attacker as well. Erica mentioned about you will use a supply chain from an attacker perspective, but I think attackers still have multiple ways to come in. And I think supply chain is one of the way, right? And if you look at MITRE ATT&CK itself, I think the initial access is just one of the means, right? So I think the point is that it will come in, and if it comes in, what can we do about it? I think so it comes back to my point, the first step is still identification, then followed by the rest of the NIST framework comes in. So a lot of things that we use from an end user perspective still apply in our work as well, I think.
And I think one of the key points there is we can't manage what we don't know. And so visibility, transparency, line of sight of supply chain is probably the biggest problem we're facing. First, Joshua, and then to Jim. Josh, what's your perspective on this? What are you seeing in terms of what we can and should be doing around this?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a thorny problem because we're dealing with large numbers. The way humans think about numbers is 1, 2, 3, many. We don't think about 30 suppliers, 10,000 suppliers to those suppliers in the case of the bank, and 140,000 suppliers to the suppliers to the suppliers. So the first problem, it's not really a problem that can be tackled on a human scale. It's a problem that needs to be tackled as a data science problem. That's the bad news. The good news is there are platforms now with the help of artificial intelligence that can make sense of this. And I think if we think about organisations and their supply chains, there's two different dynamics at play. The first part is the suppliers we have change over time. You might do an acquisition, you've suddenly got more suppliers than you knew. And those suppliers, their risk profile changes over time. So it has to have something where you're having continuous monitoring of real-time threats. The other thing I would say is we're just talking about cyber risk. At Interos, we look at geopolitical risk, sanctions lists, financial risk. I think it's important to understand that a financial risk can then manifest as a cybersecurity risk as organisations lack the funds to adequately address the problem. So in essence, it's a thorny problem. It's not a human problem. It's an AI computer-driven platform problem. I think the hope is that we can use these platforms to get visibility and act in real time.
Jim.
So look, the traditional way that supply chain risk has been managed is through questionnaires to the suppliers and through occasional audits. The problem is that questionnaire responses are biased towards the affirmative, and also they're single point in time. The issue is that at any point in time, in any large supply chain, it's likely that more than 10% of the suppliers have got a critical externally facing vulnerability that an attacker can detect, right? And that exists not because they're bad intentioned, but rather because there are new zero-day software vulnerabilities every month, and there are misconfigurations that happen in organizations that don't realize they have the misconfiguration. So to be able to identify that quickly and help the remediation process in as close to real time as you can at scale, as Josh indicated, is critical if you really want to defend a supply chain.
Absolutely, and I think that the key issue, and I think one of the key takeaways, as we saw from the CSA report, we have to drive this at a data level. We can't drive this at a people level. It's just too big, too complex, too evolving. Just before we go on, we've got 2 more questions on Slido, so I encourage you, as we're on the panel, just go into Slido, respond to the other questions. We'll actually incorporate that as part of the dialogue as well, and keen to get your feedback on what's live as well. Erica, from a policy role, what do you see government really taking, and some of the strategies to take a really key role in driving a protection position, but also a thought leadership position? around supply chain risk?
Yeah, I'll focus on the thought leadership. Protection is probably not my policy area. But I think it's following what my panel members are saying. It's really about us in government also looking into the complexity of the supply chain, taking a deep breath because it is really complex and it does take a lot of time, thinking about it from a hardware and a software perspective. And then once we've started to do that, which as I was saying when I spoke, we're starting to do that on software in particular, making sure that we're making that our thinking really transparent so that businesses know from a sort of higher starting point, because we're never going to get to an end point. This is definitely nothing, it's not a thing that government can solve on its own, that is for sure. But we can at least be saying, okay, well, look at your open source software potentially that might be at the bottom of your stack actually. Do you know anything about that? Okay, well then think about the layering on top of that. What does that build look like? Also thinking about, and I think even for the makers of the kind of hardware that we're using, we don't know necessarily where some of the chips are coming from, for example, or what the vulnerabilities might be there. So for us, it's really about saying this might be a risk, this might be a risk, this might be a risk. Then we can say some things about on a more kind of grand scale how we might fix where we see things being extra risky. So one of my other answers to what would I do if I were a cyber criminal was I'd go for the critical national infrastructure. I think here you call it critical information infrastructure. And of course you do, because if that gets attacked, then somebody's willing to pay to kind of get it working again, obviously. But then for us, when we're looking at it from a policy point of view, it's worth thinking about actually digging into some of those critical sectors and understanding the complexity of their actual supply chains. And then the last thing I think, and we're trying to work in the UK with the business policy teams to think about how we can integrate things like cyber audit into normal audit. Yep. So, things that are just happening as a natural part of the business, running a business.
So we touched on before about technology potentially being part of the problem, and Jim, you highlighted that. One of the questions here is, how can a vendor and service providers really help in terms of technology solutions to address it? So technology might be part of the problem, but interested in the views here on how can technology be part of the answer as well. Josh?
Yeah, well, I certainly think embracing that data science approach and going with data-led, finding out what the best tools are out there so you can understand, you can fix the things you can then see. I think that's really important. I think the other thing is using those platforms to run some what-if scenarios to say, how exposed are we? If this particular, Erica, to your point, the cyber criminals have an objective, right? So if they say, if we target Log4j, we can get 10,000 effects. I think it's important to be able to have a platform or use technology to be able to say how vulnerable are we, what's our supplier concentration, and run what-if scenarios. The situation in Ukraine is a classic example. I know a lot of businesses that relied very heavily on some outsourced services from Ukraine, and there's high chances they're going to be interrupted with yesterday's kamikaze drones. Running those sort of scenarios I think is massively important. So again, using technology as a lens into what could go wrong, run the what-if scenarios, look for warning measures, look for correlations of risks, etc. That's probably one step. Jim?
So yeah, let me give you two SolarWinds stories, right? So SolarWinds happens. Any of us that are responsible for cybersecurity at a company or a government got asked immediately, how many of them have it, right? One has to be able to answer that question very quickly and very accurately, because a race begins every time there's a software vulnerability. And the race is between attackers who can see it one by one and defenders who need to protect it everywhere that it exists. That can be now done, as Josh said, with technology on the defensive side. But the second SolarWinds story is, why does the problem persist in the supply chain without getting fixed? So we got asked after SolarWinds. At SolarWinds, we were able to notify all the companies affected in 90 minutes. But afterwards, there was a second SolarWinds episode called Servview, which is a company that SolarWinds owned. And one of the big data providers said to us, oh, we don't have SolarWinds. And the reason they thought they didn't is that they'd fixed SolarWinds 6 months before. They didn't realize that ServU was a SolarWinds company, and they didn't have visibility enough into their network. So if you don't have good network visibility, you don't know the software problems you've got. So the answer, I think, is exactly as Josh suggested. You need technology on the defensive side that allows you to fast see what needs to be fixed, and then you're able to help them fix it.
Singwei, one of the questions, and I think it's very relevant for yourself as CISO of a bank, is how can a vendor or a service provider that's providing services to a major organisation, how can they be recognised for the work they're doing around their cybersecurity supply chain rather than just penalised?
I think it's, in fact, that's one of the problems, is how do we identify a good cyber hygiene vendor versus another one, right? I think it's not an easy answer, right? I think, but of course, there are tools around. I think that of course we test it out, but there's only so much we can test. I mean, if you talk about SolarWinds, when you test it during that time, it probably is fine, right? And you do not know what you do not know. So this is a complex problem to solve. I don't think I have an answer to that. But to answer how do we pick a vendor? Of course, we look at their processes and we look at some of their background about how they deliver updates and they deploy software and all this. But and also some of the key things that we look at, including some of the certification, right, like the EAL and common criteria and some of the stuff, to give us some understanding about the hygiene level, right? But those help us to make a decision relative to the software providers. Yeah.
It's a good point, and the certification sort of drives us into a view of collaboration. And Erica, interested in your views on a more cooperative environment between policy and between industry, because you highlighted in your speech up front that we're not winning on this war. So it's a collective problem and it has to be a collective solution.
Yeah, I mean, as I said just now, we can't do this on our own. So we do need to understand, and this is something that will come through the work that we're doing on extending our legislation. So the good thing about that kind of legislation, where we're looking at the moment at digital service providers and we'll be looking at managed service providers, is that the regulator who does that will begin to build a relationship with those businesses, begin to build an understanding of how those businesses work. And then as we go through, because there was a reporting requirement as part of our NIS regulations, which is really good and interesting, probably one of the best bits of it actually, that we can start to build a bit of an understanding of where these incidents are happening, you know, what the impact is. You know, I'm very taken by those lovely kind of explosion diagrams where you think, okay, yeah, this is the thing, you know, what is the blast surface that's going to happen. So all of that kind of information will help us build that kind of understanding. Again, then what we're hopefully doing is not starting from zero.
And if you look at it impartially, we're not starting from zero as an industry, but we're not mature on supply chain. And so, Jim, you do a lot of work around this, around supply chain and resilience. I don't think we're at the resilience end of the spectrum yet. We're very much around the data gathering and helping organisations mature. How do we move up that curve much faster towards resilience?
So one of the things that I think is really important, and I think government can play a little bit of a hand in, is raising the issues at board level within organisations. So one of the things that we're constantly being told by the CISOs that we talk to is, well, we'd really like to build this kind of knowledge understanding of, you know, our supply chain, but you know what, we've got a day job and that costs money and I need resources for it. So some of the work that we're doing in the UK government is really beginning to understand, well, what is the cost of a cyber incident? You know, how do these things work? How much should you potentially be investing, and trying to put boards in businesses in a position where they are talking about it and they're talking to their CISOs in a completely different way.
So I'm a big fan of the partnership between regulators and the industry that gets regulated. And look, I used to be CEO of Morgan Stanley, and God knows I had 3 different banking regulators just in the US, and I probably had 60 across the world. But if you get the right combination of regulatory encouragement, right, and some regulatory oversight, including on resilience, to your point, Paul, And if you then get the individual participants knowing that there's both oversight and visibility by the regulator, you can observe things like patching behavior, right? Is the behavior that which it's supposed to be? And I think that the partnership between oversight at the government level and real industry cooperation, because we're all cyber folks, and in the cyber folks world, people help each other. So if you get collaboration at the industry level, if you get government oversight, and if you've got the individual companies building resilient supply chains, you're in a much better place.
I think it's key, and I touched on before that we're not winning this battle. And if you look at it impartially, some of that battle is being lost because of the tech giants. And a lot of the vulnerabilities are coming out of some of the tech giants. Josh, interested, given what Interos does, your views on, and it's one of the questions from the audience, what can we do to better reduce supply chain risks from the technology giants who are introducing some of these vulnerabilities into these complex supply chains?
Yeah, look, that is a really thorny problem, because I think as businesses we want to go for an easy solution that's probably priced at the lowest price point that's going to give us what we need. I think we have to think, as businesses, we need to think about supply risk, supply concentration, a backup plan, a plan B if things don't work out, and putting pressure back on our suppliers to really show us what they're going to do when things go wrong. What's day two going to look like? And this is, I don't think we ask those questions enough until there's some sort of calamity. But I think the other thing is, I've wanted to use a food metaphor today because we're Singaporeans, we love food. If you think about hawker centres, there's, 6,000 hawker stalls in Singapore. We rate them A, B and C for their hygiene status. Now, if we thought about a risk to a bank, you might say, well, I've rated my suppliers and I'm not dealing with this level. We should actually publish that to the other banks and to the industry. And I think that's where government can play a role, because if we're all eating in the lowest possible hygiene standard hawker centre, we're probably all going to get sick fairly soon, which is going to lead to the problem of resilience, which we're going to have to overcome. So I think there is a role there for raising the bar with suppliers in general, but also publishing that across industry and across government so that we make better decisions. When we go to a register of these businesses, we can sort of see where they sit. I think that's a pretty key point. Yep. And I don't think the big end of town should be exempt from that either, frankly.
Absolutely.
Hey, Paul, can I say something about the tech giants?
Yep.
I'm a big fan of the tech giants because I think that they've got actually the world's best cybersecurity. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have vulnerabilities in the software, right? Last month there was another Microsoft one. However, the great thing about the tech giants is as soon as it's found, they will immediately publish the patch. They'll spread the patch wherever they can. And the problem in the supply chain is not everybody in the supply chain is following that, yes. Right? So as a result, the tech giant has a problem. They immediately acknowledge it. They communicate it broadly. But our unfortunate job in the supply chains is to work with the long tail in the supply chain that won't fix things on their own. And that requires visibility, oversight, and remedial help.
And it does go back to Singwei's comment, we can only manage what we know, and if we don't know where it's being used, this is the whole thing about visibility and transparency in line of sight. If we don't know where it is, we can't fix it, we can't triage it, that creates risk. And in that vein, Singwei, interested if we pivot the discussion more towards what should we be doing on a proactive view? What are some of those strategies, both from a preventative and a response, that organisations can and should put in place?
Since I've come from the end user perspective, so I will share a bit about what we can manage it and leave the big problem about regulation to the people here, right? I think from our perspective, we focus on a few things, right? I mentioned about identification, right? The other part is actually protection, right? Protection, there are many things that we apply is still reusable, fortunately, right? I mean, for example, what we can do is harden our system, isolate our system, segment our system, design in anticipation of failure, such that we can ring fence them. I think all these things we can talk through and we can start it first. But of course, that focus on what we can manage, right? Of course, we can't manage. Let's say Microsoft release a patch and the patch contain some vulnerable component that actually such as SolarWinds, right? Those are more difficult to catch. But that is the hardening part and the protection part. And the second part is actually detection. Even though they can come in, but they need to go out, they need to move around. And there's another detection part that we can actually do a lot of things around it. Yeah. And similarly, what our good practice about all the detection techniques that we know applies here as well, right? I mean, once they can come in, they need to go out. And finally, I think we need to, in anticipation of all this fail, right? How do we respond? So the response, after we identify, we have all this control, we need to have the people and the process to manage this. And worst case, if that go to a big event, how do you manage the crisis management? All that comes in as well. So I think the typical about identification, protection, detection, and the response, recover comes into play. Yeah.
Absolutely. Interesting question from Peter. It feels like this boils down to transparency. You know, what are the main barriers to transparency, and how could we normalise this? Is legislation needed? Interested both from a provider view and also from, Erica, from your view, from a policy view, the role of legislation in this and how it can help or at least improve the situation. Josh?
Yeah, I think legislation plays a key role because it's the stick that people are going to respond to. Like if there's a rule, if there's a guidance, if there's a regulation, if there's consequence. My girls in the morning when they're running late for school, I say, hurry up. And they say, why? There's no consequence for being late at their school. I'm like, I can't fix that problem. If I was to legislate that there was a problem, they would then react to it. So I think legislation, being a former government guy, unsurprising, I would say that. So you've got to have some regulation, but there's a path to that, right? The same as we've done with the cybersecurity laws in Singapore. You start with guidelines, you increase over time, you ratchet them up. You don't just bombard people with it because then you'll never get them on board. I think, Paul, what we're trying to change is cultural behaviour, which is extremely difficult to do. So we've got to plot that journey for where it's going to be, and one day it's going to end up with severe regulations for non-compliance, but we don't start there. So I think that's the first bit. I think we live in an information age where it is possible for organisations like Interos to be able to have visibility of literally millions of suppliers. So it's not all incumbent upon one company to say they know those things. But I think the other thing then is to make that vulnerability of that blast radius, as in the video, visible to decision makers, boards, governments, industry bodies, so they can do, as they have in my house, I've got a bomb shelter, we can understand what to do in a blast radius, what you do, what's going to be affected. And that might lead to people saying, okay, if these are going to be vulnerable, maybe we won't offshore them, we'll nearshore them, or we'll bring them in-house, or we'll have a higher level of interaction with our suppliers, not just regulatory, but also collaboratively to say, listen, you're now part of the bank's infrastructure, there are new rules and conditions that you have to have, and cascade some of those onto them. So I think that transparency can lead to that greater integration for the critical elements, but there's definitely a role for legislation there, but let's get there at the right pace.
I mean, so I would completely agree. I think in some cases there is a role for legislation, but I would hugely agree that, and this is exactly how we've been doing our cybersecurity work, start with a code of practice, see how that goes, monitor compliance, understand what's happening, and then for me, just as a part of some kind of balance, when you look to legislation, be really clear that you're kind of aiming in at the most critical points of risk. And so that's why in the UK, we have some legislation that is around transparency, but it's only looking at what we call critical national infrastructure. If we were to extend that very broadly, the cost to us and the regulators who would have to implement it, and the cost to the businesses would be, we think, disproportionate right now. So codes of practice are out there for everybody, monitoring some kind of compliance. I agree, making sure that it's a normal conversation inside of the governance, and then where we see particular issues because the risk gets really high, then legislation is proportionate, I think.
And Singwei, how do you see legislation as helping or hindering, particularly as it starts to focus the senior management?
Actually, I like what Joshua mentioned, I think, about, I think as a buyer or as a consumer, it's difficult to choose, right? I think, and of course, I think you mentioned about hawker center. I mean, the other one I can think of is about all my refrigerator, there's a label 1 tick, 2 tick, and 3 ticks. I think if cyber or even technology solution, if they can give a cyber labeling, I think that will help significantly. Of course, it will set the baseline. I mean, some of the things that the very rare event like the RSA, like the SolarWinds may unfortunately still may not be helpful, but at least it gives buyer or consumer something to choose about, and they can actually relatively compare the different solutions. I think that's my thought, yeah.
Paul, if I could, I think we've got to be careful about legislation because legislation, you know, you can say you have to have good cybersecurity, right? If you try and legislate much more finely detailed than that, the application in different industries and different sizes of businesses becomes challenging. So then you need some combination of legislation and regulation where regulators actually interact with the supply chain members. But again, the regulators may or may not have sufficient knowledge to finally regulate actual cybersecurity. So we need systems that set up essentially dialogue between legislation, regulation, and the industry participants who actually in detail know what they're doing. And the industry participants guiding the regulators and partnering with the regulators strikes me as being fundamental.
And I think what we're landing on here is it's a spectrum over time, that we're starting from a relatively low base as an industry. There's roles of technology companies, there's roles of government, there's roles of cooperation, but we have to move up the maturity curve. So interested in perspectives from each of you. What are those practical steps? What is the near-term view in the next 1 to 2 years that organisations and industry and government, the focus areas that we should be putting in place in terms of moving up that curve? Josh?
Yeah, so I think first of all acknowledging that it's a problem that can be improved, maybe not solved overnight, and the objective should be we're going to be better. We're going to be better tomorrow than we were today. So I think that's a start, because otherwise these things can seem just too difficult to embark upon. I think the second thing we should do is we should understand, you know, how do we get to that point where we get it? What are the best tools out there for us to understand? And let's start with, let's really know our tier 1 suppliers, and let's have some idea of who our tier 2 suppliers are. And then let's understand what our risk profile is and where those suppliers fit within that, and which elements of those suppliers should we take a closer look at. I mean, we have to start triaging this problem, it seems to me. We're not going to eat the whole elephant in one go. So I think let's take those steps towards that with a view to getting better and better, reducing the risk over time. I don't see how we can tackle the problem just with the press of a button. So that would be the first step.
Yeah, and to your point, Josh, I think that there are multiple steps, some of which everybody's taken some part of now. So the first step is you got to understand who the suppliers are. Second step is you need to risk tier them in terms of the kinds of risks that they pose to your organization. To Sungwee's point, right, it's hard to go up chain if you've got a well-defended company. On the other hand, if your data is sitting out with some law firm or some employment firm, it's vulnerable. And so you need to know who's got critical aspects of intellectual property, of data, right, and of core service delivery. Then once you know who the critical suppliers are, you need to establish both what they say their cyber posture is, which you can do through questionnaires, and you need external visibility for continuous monitoring to see if they're actually living up to it. You can do all those things, and those, given technology these days, both our companies both have and others do too, it's completely doable in a leverageable way. That is not complete cybersecurity in the supply chain, because what you really want to know over time is which of the suppliers are good enough for you in terms of cyber posture and which aren't, and that requires some observation over time.
Which introduces risk and says we have to get much better at risk. Governments aren't always the best at risk because it's often more of a organisational view and government's more around policy and control. Interested, Eric, in your view on how government can really help here on the risk frameworks and really the drive around prioritisation.
Yeah, and I think our role is, while partners are doing that, beginning to build understanding, is to try and start at that lowest level that we've been talking about and start to, in the collaboration, build codes of practice. So okay, this is what we're learning, and we're learning some things and implementing and learning some more things. And so, my teams, and a good example at the moment is we're looking at app security. And so you start by, okay, well, what's going on out there? Ask the questions, knowing, as you quite rightly say, we don't know this in government, right? So you need to go out and ask the questions. Then you need to say, is there really something that we need to do here? And you're saying that internally, but you're also saying it externally, so you're getting that kind of validation. If the answer is yes, then okay, well, what kind of things should we be doing? And what should that look like? And what kind of questions should we be suggesting that you ask yourselves? Who should have responsibilities in different places? Those are the kinds of things that are good in codes of practice. But definitely on a first stage level and underpinning most of the work that we're doing is that kind of first stage of collaborative building of codes of practice. Then you go out, you test them, you start seeing whether people are using them, and then, you know, that's what I think, that's where we are in the next couple of years on software and the supply chain work that we're starting to do.
So from my perspective, from an end user perspective again, I think I agree with Jim. I think at the end, the supply chain problem is so big. Where do we start? So I think we prioritize and focus on our crown jewel or where the data is. I think it's a risk-based approach, right? Focus on that. And then identification, I like the video just now. I think it's about how do we map your tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. But we focus on what matters first, because I think in our bank perspective, we have 1,000 over applications. I think how do we start? And 1,000 application doesn't mean 1,000 supplier. I think we have more than that as well. So we have to focus on what matters first and prioritize. I think that is how we will tackle and from a risk-based approach. Yeah.
And just on that risk-based approach, CSA have taken a leading position as we spoke about earlier, similar to UK government. Eric, I'm interested in your views here on how we can scale this, because government's got a key role to play with industry. How do we scale this quicker? We all accept the immediacy of the problem. We have to respond faster. So key on your perspectives on what are those near-term accelerators we can put in place? So
the kind of things that we're doing is talking to other governments, and that really does help accelerate, because we're building our understanding. I mean, these are not domestic markets, mostly. So we build our understanding, the US are building their understanding, here in Singapore, building their understanding, and it's why we're at conferences like this. So you're making sure that as we're building our codes of practice and we're thinking about these different things that we're sharing across different nations, and we're trying to think about things, and I think, to be fair, the will is really there to think about these things in the same way. Now, you know, the upside of that is that on the other side, the people who are providing these services ideally are only being, you know, given one set of rules, and obviously that makes that's a big bonus. But also from our side, we can say, well, how does it work here? And they can say, you know, how does it work for you? And I think that really does accelerate our thinking.
Jim, interested in your views on the supply chain in terms of the frequency of exploits, and given those some sectors are more exploited than others, what can we learn from that? What are some of the strategies we can put in place to actually help some of the other sectors?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because sectors get affected, you know, frequently by attacks that are not even directed at the sector, right? Because what attackers are doing is looking for software vulnerabilities or misconfigurations broadly. They'll target companies that are showing those, and that in turn will impact the companies that use them, which may or may not be concentrated in a sector. So my view is that supply chain defenses are particularly advanced in financial services, because financial services have been at the lead of cybersecurity defense for a while. I think you see in other sectors, the defenses and therefore the observation of the supply chain is less developed, and I think that the need to change that is pretty acute.
And just as an extension to that, Josh, a lot of this dialogue's been about software. What about the hardware vendors?
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of touched on it earlier, being able to very, very quickly understand how your organisation, being you, suppliers, suppliers, and suppliers, what their exposure to that hardware is. If there's some other exploit that can be, some other vulnerability that can be exploited, you need immediate visibility of that, and you need to understand how you could break those linkages or quarantine the effect of that exploit. But similarly, Paul, I think it goes beyond that. There are other categories of risks that will manifest later on as a cybersecurity risk through an organisation when it's vulnerable on one level, geopolitical risk, financial risk, being on sanctions lists. It may be possible for attackers to undermine other areas where executive attention has been taken away from cyber, let's say, to focus on another problem. If I was an attacker, like Eric was, I'd probably pick vulnerable organisations that are vulnerable on other axes to go and do my cyber attack, because I'd say that's not where the executive attention is at the moment.
And the more we know about the supply chain from a cyber view, the more we know about concentration risk and geopolitical risk, and they are all interwoven. And I think COVID's been a key pivot for us. Sengwei, interested in what you've learned through COVID on supply chain risk in terms of the style of attacks, the frequency of attacks, and the maturity of the responses that you have in place.
Sorry, just to clarify, you're talking about the supply chain attack. Yeah. I think fortunately, I have not experienced one myself, but I think we did respond to the SolarWinds case at I think some time back. And I think, interestingly, I don't know whether it should be public, but I think we are not using the version that's affected at the point of time, right? Yeah. But I think we also have a reasonably good inventory to know that where are our SolarWinds being deployed at the point of time. So what we do was actually about containment and identify whether are we impacted, and as a result, what are our corresponding actions. So therefore, I think what I mentioned about when we introduce something, how do we segment the network, whether if this is a assumed breach, which we was to take this out, whether what is your alternative, and what is the impact if SolarWinds is not is unable to serve its purpose, for example, in the case of the SolarWinds case, right? So I'm just very specific about this. The one that actually happened to us is that we encountered is SolarWinds. Okay, I forgot about the Log4j as well. So Log4j is another one that we went through, try to find out where our Log4j being deployed, as a result, do the containment and the necessary actions. Yeah.
And the likes of Log4j, Jim, what do we learn from those that we can actually help on the next attack? Because I think one of the big things we have to get better of is learning from the past and informing the future response and protection.
So can I say two things? The first is, can I answer a cousin of what did we learn from COVID? It's, in Blue Point, we, among other things, in addition to supply chain defense, we do incident response. And the war in Ukraine triggered something very interesting for us and other incident response firms, which is that the number of successful ransomware attacks went down by 50%, 50%, half as many. You've probably seen that in parts of your business too. And it's what that tells us is where the attacks were coming from, right? They were coming from the nation that's otherwise engaged right now. To answer the second question, what do we learn from things like Log4j, is I think we've learned that the ability to spot where that is, right? To spot whether the version is at risk, to your point, Son, right? And to give the affected supplier the patch in time is just very important. Because as you showed in the video, unassisted, we know by observation that within 30 days, less than 15% of medium-sized and even larger suppliers will patch it on their own. With assistance, meaning if the company itself tells them we want you to fix it, that goes up to over 70%. So what we know from observation is that a number of companies need help in order to take corrective action when there is something like Log4j.
Are you highlighting there that the awareness is not at the right level?
I think it's a combination of lack of awareness and lack of specific awareness that you even have it in your network. Right.
I think it's about knowing ourselves, right? I mean, we say identify and where are the Log4j itself is a good example. I think it's really very difficult to know those that we use ourselves, those that the software that we use or the hardware that we use that contain the Log4j. And of course, those are part whereby we really dig out all our, you call it software, bill of material or whatever, just to dig out whatever things that we have and try to match against whether it's deployed. Of course, again, come back to the prioritization and the risk base. We go from the internet facing first and then subsequently from outside in, right? But I think it sounded like quite easy, but it's tremendously difficult.
It was very hard. You had to update every day when you learned someone else had Log4j embedded in the software. Yeah.
I framed up front that last 5 years is probably going to be easier than the next 5 years. As we come to the end of the panel, I'm interested in each of the panelists' perspectives of, within that context, what should we do? What should we really focus on in each of your respective areas that is going to drive the most impact for industry and society?
A massive question to start down this end of the panel. I think acknowledging that we've come through a massive challenging time. COVID, we talked about, cyber attacks up 600%. Many banks in Singapore, I can't speak for DBS, but certainly another bank went from almost all their employees at work to almost all their employees at home. Massive expansion of the attack surface. Now, whether we return to normal or some form of new normal, work is going to be done differently. I think let's pick up on some of the lessons we learnt during that period, because they weren't all bad. A lot of them were learning experiences. Let's pick up on the things we learnt for Log4j, like understanding how one relatively obscure application or program could have affected us. I think it's understanding those things and then having a really robust conversation around the board to say, if you want everything at the absolute lowest price with the biggest supply chain in the world, you know, it introduces risks, and having a mature conversation about that. And I think that's something that now that the CISO risks are at the boardroom table, we have to have that corresponding discussion, and that's a mature discussion. That's about saying, why don't we water down our, increase our costs if we have to reduce our risks. And I don't see those conversations happening, but I think it's something that should be happening. And then making the corresponding investment. And Paul, to the point that you opened up with, I think as providers of technology platforms, we have to show how the ROI works, how this investment is going to mitigate a risk, how it's going to put us in a better position. We're not just doing it for fun, we're doing it because it's going to mitigate some business problem. But really having a mature, holistic discussion about risk and about expenditure, that people go into it with their eyes open to say, I can do these things, but it's going to come at this sort of cost, etc. That was kind of what I think.
I think that, as Sangwei suggested, understanding the external crown jewel assets, right, is now as important as understanding the internal ones, which is something we've been doing for the last 4 years. Once you understand those external ones, making sure that they're both contractually questionnared and continuously monitored and assisted when there are vulnerabilities that you can see, that an attacker will see, is completely doable now given the technologies and needs to be the next step forward.
May I go back to listening to what's happening outside with partners, and then thinking about our interventions being at that kind of locus where the risk balance really tips into the red?
I think from our end user perspective as well, I think we continue our journey, because some of the control that the mindset that apply is actually applied for supply chain risk as well. So our concept of, people call it zero trust, but we call it inside equal to outside. So what you apply on the outside and the inside, there's no difference anymore, right? I mean, how you protect an external internet-facing asset and how you protect an internal asset. In the past, we say there are differences, but I think right now there's no difference. I think it's getting similar. I think everyone is work from everywhere. And the concept about assumed breach and what happens if it's compromised, what are your possible actions, right? I mean, your isolation, your containment, your segmentation, all these things come useful. And in short, I think we will continue our journey on the inside equal to outside control technologies that apply internally.
And in final summary, as a risk professional, I would sum it up to say, and we touched on it earlier, you can't manage what you don't know. That the key focus here is we have to get better at line of sight and transparency. And I think that the program that we've touched on that CSA are running here is a key driver of that, is let's understand from a Singapore perspective the supply chain, the breadth of it, the interconnected nature, the concentration risk. Once we understand the risk, we're in a much better position to manage, govern and triage the risk. We're at time. Please join me in thanking the panellists for a wonderful debate and discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Some good answers there. Watch the step on the way down.
I was going to say the same thing to you.
One more time, ladies and gentlemen, for our panelists and our moderator, please. Thank you. And with that, we've come to the end of our Cyber Supply Chain Conversation 2022. We hope you found that very useful. I think lots of conversations will be sparked from that. And at this point, we'd like to invite you to the foyer to enjoy some post-event networking and some refreshments that we've got prepared for you. Also, we look forward to seeing you across the next few days. We have very exciting programs lined up for you right here on this level. Until then, have a wonderful rest of the afternoon ahead. Thank you.